Well, here I am again. And thanks, Chuck, for that nice intro. After giving a kind of very serious discussion on a very serious topic earlier, I want to turn now to some good news, because I never come down here with good news to talk about. And it's nice to come down and talk to you about some good news. I want to thank Chuck, and I want to thank the Rock County Progressives for inviting me here. And yeah, election night was a great night. I gotta just say it. And I am still on cloud nine. I'm basking in it, and I want to encourage you to bask in this victory. We don't have enough victories to celebrate. When they come around, we should really enjoy them, because there's so many other fights to fight. And if we just go on the next day to the next battle, it's hard to really recuperate and really savor what we earned, which was this amazing victory over Scott Walker and Scott Walkerism. And we need to remember what we were living under for 8 years. And I think a lot of us didn't feel until last Wednesday, how heavy that weight was that Scott Walker placed on our shoulders. Because for 8 years, he was kicking progressives in the teeth. And I was just wondering, how many times can we be kicked in the teeth by the same boot? I mean, it happened, on 3 different elections. And it looked like for a while there was going to happen again. I mean, he and Brad Schimmel, they were trying to tear down every pillar of progressivism here in Wisconsin. They were trying to deface every progressive landmark and every landmark of democracy in Wisconsin for 8 years. And now their reign of reaction is over. There finally is a check on this wrecking crew. And that is a great thing. And I think we should try to figure out and analyze how it happened, and then where to go from here. But let me just tell you where I was on election night. I was on TV. I don't love going on TV, and I don't do it very often, but I've been doing this little gig on WISC Channel 3, the CBS affiliate in Madison, with Neil Heinen and Brandon Schultz, my conservative sparring partner, for about 15 years now. And I actually like Brandon as a person. I like his wife, Carla, and I respect his intelligence. He's a Republican mechanic. He's a campaign mechanic. He's a strategist. He was the guy who who ran the campaign for Scott Klug that knocked out Bob Kastenmeier. So he knows what he's doing. He knows how to make the Republican engine work. And he's a savvy guy. And so we go back and forth and have for years and years. And I do think we should be able to do that in a civil way in our society. And one thing I like about the fact that Neil Heinen asks us on there is we have these debates, but we aren't calling each other names. We're not throwing things at each other. We're not violent with each other. And the problem in this country, and also in Wisconsin right now, is that there are fewer and fewer venues where you can have civil discourse between people on one side and people on another. It used to be that I was on that Joy Cardine show on Friday mornings every 7th or 8th week, and there were always debates. It wasn't just me. There was a debate every Friday between a conservative and a liberal. And it was a civilized conversation that I thought was very interesting, and it was a necessary forum to have. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel used to have an opinion page. It doesn't have an opinion page anymore, and it's the biggest newspaper in the state. That's outrageous. And so there are just fewer and fewer places where we can talk across our divides. And that's sad. It's sad in our democracy. It leads to the hyper-partisanship, and it leads to a lack of empathy for people on the other side. It also leads to intellectual laziness, because you don't have to confront views that don't comport with your own. I mean, I used to live on the Isthmus of Madison for 25 years, and I could go a week without running into someone who disagreed with me. It was a very liberal neighborhood, surrounded, with liberal professors at the UW, or people who worked at progressive nonprofits like I did. And you can, in this country, if you're a progressive, you can watch Amy Goodman in the morning. You can go, if you're lucky enough to work at a progressive nonprofit in Madison, you can go do that. And then you can read The Nation when you get home, and then turn on MSNBC, and then go to bed and start all over again the next day. And if you're in a liberal cocoon like Madison, you are really not bumping into other ideas and having to confront them. And it's important to confront them. It's important to have some empathy and sympathy with people who don't agree with you, not the people flying the Nazi flags and the Confederate flags. That's a waste of time and maybe dangerous. But it is important to recognize, and I'm sure all of you here in Janesville recognize it, that a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump are not flying Confederate flags and Nazi flags and are not horrible human beings. It's just that they didn't like Hillary Clinton for whichever reason, whether bad or good. They were sick of politics as usual or politicians as usual. Let's remember who were the two most popular people other than Hillary Clinton in 2016. It was this talk show host, this reality TV show blowhard, and a Jewish socialist from Vermont who'd never combed his hair in his life. I mean, it was not politics as usual and politicians as usual, because I think people are sick of politics as usual and politicians as usual. And it's just important to recognize that that had an appeal, that Trump appeal of being not a politician and of being entertaining. And when politics has become a spectator sport, the guy who's the most entertaining performer sometimes gets the most votes. And I think that also was happening. And then there were people who said, well, the system's messed up, I'm going to throw a monkey wrench into it or roll the dice. And they rolled the dice and it came out like this. But I do think it's important to talk to those people who don't already agree with us. The art of politics is getting your folks out and talking to a fraction of the other side or people who don't necessarily agree with you already, that your vision, our vision of what is just and beautiful, right and American, and for justice and liberty and equality is the right way to go. And I do think it is possible to convince a decent fraction of people who voted for Donald Trump that there is a better way, a more humane way, a more just way, a way that corresponds with what's best about America. And so I think that's the task. And it'll still be the task in 2 years. But let me just look at, try to look at what happened here in Wisconsin, because I think it's interesting. For a while there on the set on Tuesday night, I was very confident that Evers was going to win. I was confident because of the early voting that had happened in Madison and Milwaukee before the polls opened over the prior 2 weekends. It was astronomical. And then turnout in Madison was huge. I was getting these reports of just tremendous turnout. 92% of registered voters at the time had come. And ultimately it was about 67% of those who were eligible to vote in Madison voted, 70% of Dane County in total. And so those were amazing figures. And then after the polls closed, I was still really hopeful that Evers was going to win, because I had printed out from the Wisconsin Elections Commission the county results from the past 2 races, from the Trump-Clinton race and from the Mary Burke Walker race. And I'd done it county by county, and I did the math because they hadn't done the percentages. They just had the raw vote total. So I did 144 equations, and pretty basic math anyway, to see what the percentages were in each county. And I could tell right away that Walker was underperforming in places like Waukesha County and Washington County and Ozaukee County, the heart of Walker land. And if he wasn't performing well there where most of his votes were, he was going to be in real trouble. So I was really confident until about 12:30 at night. I'm still on the set, because at 12:30 at night, 100% at Dane County had already been counted. Every single Democratic vote in Dane County had been counted. 98% of Milwaukee County had been counted, we thought. And there weren't a lot of Democratic votes left. La Crosse County wasn't in, and that goes slightly Democratic. Brown County wasn't in, and that goes slightly, even slightly more Republican. So it looked kind of dark there for a second. But about 5 or 10 minutes later, all of a sudden 40,000 ballots from Milwaukee County were discovered, uncounted, and we all knew then that we had a new governor. And so that was kind of amazing, and I could barely contain a smile at that point. So it was much better than 2 years ago when Trump won, and Paul Ryan, your representative, Speaker of the House, was being interviewed on TV and said it was a great night for America. And no, he said it was a good night for America. And I whispered to Brandon Schultz and Neil Heinen, it's good night, America. And we're wrestling with that right now. But here in Rock County, I just want to applaud the people of Rock County for doing your part. Here are some figures. Walker lost Rock County 58-39 by my calculation. That's That's more than in 2014 when he lost 56-43. Evers won by 12,776 votes, which is a little more than 5,000 votes better than what Mary Burke did here. And so that was a big thing. And this is a really cool statistic. Get this. In Rock County, as in Dane County, Tony Evers got more votes than Hillary Clinton got. More people came out and voted for Tony Evers as Democrats than voted for Hillary Clinton, which is amazing. In a presidential year, it almost always far exceeds what happens in the midterms. And so let's look at what happened. Why is it that Evers won? Why is it that Walker lost? And let me just preface this by saying it was odd. It was odd in some ways that Tony Evers won. It was odd because unemployment is at a record low in Wisconsin. And Walker had that to brag about and did brag about it. It was odd because 54% of Wisconsinites in the last Marquette Law School poll said Wisconsin was on the right track. And usually when a majority says the state's on the right track, the person in power, the governor, gets reelected or the president gets reelected. Walker also was enjoying an approval rating at 50-46. Not great, but he was at the magic 50 mark, so you wonder if 50% of Wisconsinites think he's doing a good job, maybe he's going to get reelected. And then there's the thing that we study, as Chuck said, every day at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, which is money, and Walker had an enormous money advantage. He had more than a 3-to-1 money advantage, both in the amount of money that he himself raised in his campaign, and that his campaign coffers got, but also in the money that came in from these independent expenditure groups. Americans for Prosperity spent about almost $7.5 million to try to get Walker reelected. And the Republican Governors Association spent, in combination, they had two groups, almost $10 million to get Walker reelected. That's why your screens were being splattered with mud in the last couple of weeks. It was disgusting. It was disgusting in the AG's race too. And that was one of the dirtiest campaigns I saw on both sides. Both campaigns were saying that the other guy is more gentle to sex offenders than anyone under the sun. Don't vote for him. And so it was unpleasant to watch. But yeah, so and the final thing why I think it was odd is, and I'm going to be frank, Walker is a better tactical politician than Tony Evers. Tony Evers seemed kind of bumbly in the first debate. I don't think his ads were that great. He's not a great public speaker. Walker's super polished. But the irony is that that may have been a negative for Walker because people could see through the super polish. We're sick of the super polish. And again, he seemed like a cardboard politician as usual, and people don't like politicians as usual anymore. And so Evers was kind of a good foil. I mean, here was a guy who wasn't a career politician, didn't seem like he, since he was 5 years old, wanted to be president of the United States or governor of Wisconsin, who actually had a paying job that wasn't a job as a politician, was a teacher and a principal and a superintendent before he ran the state school system. And so I think that worked to his advantage. I mean, he seemed super authentic where Walker seemed super false. And Walker seemed false when he tried to claim the mantle as the education governor. Everyone knew that he had savaged K-12 education. And so and then when he had a late night near-death conversion to pre-existing condition coverage. I mean, people could understand that he had 8 years to protect people's pre-existing conditions, and people understood that he and Brad Schimmel actually had filed a lawsuit to try to destroy the Affordable Care Act, which was the only guarantee we have of coverage for pre-existing conditions. So it totally rang false. And so there was this Walker fatigue going on. And also fatigue, people were very unhappy that he ran for president, and he was a terrible candidate. I mean, you remember when he was on those debates under all those lights and didn't cast a shadow. I mean, he just did not stand up. And people understood that maybe he wasn't out for the people of Wisconsin, but he was out for himself. And that's why Evers' campaign kept saying, how he's out for his own political ambitions and not out for you and me, and it helped. Another thing is the issues. This was another weird election, and in that the economy was not the most important issue to people. In poll after poll, nationwide and in Wisconsin, the #1 issue was health care. And it's amazing that it took Democrats this long to talk about the Affordable Care Act in a way that is winning. First of all, they didn't call it Obamacare, and President Obama made a mistake to agree to call it Obamacare. And I remember watching a debate he was having with Romney during his re-election campaign, where he said, I kind of like the ring of that Obamacare. It was never about Obama. I mean, you know, was Social Security called FDR care? No, it was called Social Security. The Affordable Care Act was about giving people affordable health care and making sure they had health care coverage. And the most important thing, the easiest sell of the Affordable Care Act was the sell on pre-existing conditions, because everyone is either ill or has a loved one who's been ill. And no one wants themselves or their loved one to die because they don't have health care coverage, or for that family to get bankrupted because they don't have health care coverage. So this is something that struck home for every single person in Wisconsin and every single American, I think, and that's why there are great gains. One of the reasons great gains across the country. The number 2 issue in the Marquette poll, K through 12 education. What better person to sell education than Tony Evers? And so that worked tremendously in his favor. And the third one was the economy. That was Walker's issue. The fourth one was roads. Roads was Evers' issue. 3 of the 4 issues, 3 of the 4 top issues were Democratic issues. And so that was also in Evers' favor. The third thing was Trump. And I think Trump was really important here, because I think this was the first time that people in this country were able to register their disgust with Trump, other than being in those protests, which were important. But people really wanted to say no to Trump. I actually, this time around, more so than during the recalls, I had more people in the last 10 days of the election come up to me and say, how can I help? Who can I call? How can I sign up to drive people to the polls? Do I need to go to Milwaukee? Where in Madison should I be? Or where up in Brown County should I go? And that didn't even happen during the height of the hysteria over the recalls. I don't want to call it hysteria. The height of the outrage, legitimate outrage over the recalls. So people really understood that it was important to get involved. And Trump's issue of immigration, this last issue, this horrible racist demagoguery from Trump on the so-called caravan, on the immigration issue, didn't really work in Wisconsin. At most, it worked for some of his base. It wasn't an issue in the top 10 issues in one of the Marquette polls. And it was at 2% among independents. Independents didn't care about the immigration issue. And so he was trying to sell something that people didn't want to buy. And if anything, it just reinforced the attitude of the progressive base that we need to get out and beat this racist and say no to racism and demagoguery in this country, and also to the independent and moderate Republican women in places like Waukesha County who just don't like that kind of hate politics. And I think Trump and Leah Vukmir, who also embodied that kind of hate politics, and who lashed herself to Donald Trump, and who ran a hideously ugly campaign calling Tammy Baldwin a terrorist, on Team Terrorist, and superimposing Tammy's face with Sheikh Khalid Mohammed, one of the 9/11 masterminds, because Tammy Baldwin had the integrity not to vote for the CIA nominee who was a torturer. You know, this was disgraceful by Leah Vukmir, and she tried to buff her image by saying she's a caring nurse. My wife's a caring nurse. You know, Leah Vukmir is not a caring person, and I think her true colors came out and people understood that. So Trump and Leah Vukmir, the combination just did not help Scott Walker, who was a much better politician than Leah Vukmir and tried to distance himself a little bit from Trump by saying he had no opinion whatsoever on immigration, which is an absurd thing to say anyway. But he knew he was in trouble there anyway. And the fourth and final thing was the tremendous organizing that happened in the state, not just by the Evers campaign themselves and the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, but by a whole range of outside groups and some nonprofit groups who did amazing work registering people to vote and activating voters and getting voters to the polls. And I'm talking about the League of Women Voters and Common Cause that paid for getting people to the polls in Milwaukee, gave people free rides in Milwaukee. Union Cab gave people free rides in Madison to the polls. There was a group called Vote Riders that got people out. There was a group called Souls to the Polls in Milwaukee a great activist, Anita Johnson, who's been rooted in the African-American community in Milwaukee for 7 decades now and has done voter registration for Citizen Action and Vote Riders and other groups. She would get people after church and take them to to register them to vote. Wisconsin Voices is a group that I'm on the board of, which is an umbrella group that did a great deal of work getting people registered to vote and activated to vote. And so it was an effort really of thousands, probably tens of thousands of people doing organizing work that got people to the polls and got Evers over the hump. So it was a real group effort, and you know, I'm still smiling, I gotta say. The question then is, what now? You know, what is to be done now? What should our focus be? And short term is this amazing effort to subvert the will of the people that Speaker Voss and Majority Leader Fitzgerald are engaging in right now, and they didn't have the good grace to wait 24 hours even before saying they were going to call back the legislature and take power away from the governor. Finally, they woke up in the middle of the night and discovered that the governor of Wisconsin has too much power, the same power that they were enjoying so immensely for 8 years. Finally, they think it's a bad thing. So I think it's really transparent and self-serving, and that the people of Wisconsin will see through this charade and this real subversion of our system of checks and balances, our separation of powers, that they're going to finally now come back and write some laws and ram them through while they can in this last couple months to deprive the people of Wisconsin essentially of their choice for governor, or of the ability of their choice for governor to do what he's been entitled to do for decades here in Wisconsin. So that is a really anti-democratic, capital D, and anti-democratic, small d, move that I think all people of goodwill who understand fairness in Wisconsin, all people who like to be Wisconsin nice, should stand up and holler about. So I would encourage you to write letters to the editor of the Janesville Gazette and put an end to this effort by Speaker Voss and Fitzgerald to really override the will, subvert the will of the people, as expressed in voting, the most democratic thing you could do in a democracy. So that's just outrageous. And then after Evers is inaugurated, I think we need to look to do a couple things. First, we need to restore some of the pillars of progressivism and some of the landmarks of democracy here in Wisconsin, and the DNR is first and foremost that comes to mind. I mean, what they have done to our great natural resources in this state has been disgraceful. You know, they took climate change, they scrubbed climate change from the website, for God's sake. I love Tony Evers saying, you know, I was a science teacher, I believe in science. I believe there is such a thing as climate change, and that that humans have had an effect on a negative effect on the climate. So I thought that was funny and great of him to say. And yeah, we'll get climate change back on the website of the DNR, but more than that, we'll have the DNR that does its job, and its job under Kathy Stepp and her successor has been to sell off our public lands and water and air to whichever company comes knocking. Basically, what Walker did in his years in office was turn Wisconsin into an ATM for his business buddies. Any business that came knocking, any donor that put $1,000 or $10,000 in his hat got something in return. And it was horrible for our environment. I mean, these high-capacity wells that the factory farms and frac sand mining companies have been using to suck up the water supply in Wisconsin. High-capacity well, that term doesn't even get close to describing what happens. These are wells that are literally sucking up, at a minimum, 100,000 gallons of fresh water every single day. Every single day, at least 100,000 gallons of water being sucked up by high-capacity wells. That's why these heretofore not radical groups like Trout Unlimited have been against the high-capacity wells, because the trout streams are evaporating. And this is why some people who are, you know, were conservative aren't so conservative anymore, because the family cottage up north that had a pier on the lake, that pier is not on the lake anymore, because the lake has receded 100 yards. And it's receded 100 yards because these companies are sucking the water out of the ground. And I think people are understanding what that has done to our environment. So restoring the DNR is important. Restoring the UW system is important. And Tony Evers will have the ability in May to appoint a couple people to the Board of Regents right away. And then in the next May, he'll have more vacancies to appoint. And so the policy of the UW system will turn in a more progressive direction. It is outrageous. I gave a talk up at UW Stevens Point to a history class, which will no longer be in Stevens Point, because they're getting rid of, if you can believe it, the history department at UW Stevens Point. And the history department at UW Stevens Point used to be a great department. I know several people who graduated from UW Stevens Point and were turned on to politics by their history professor. One history professor was an expert on the JFK assassination, and he got a lot of people interested in politics just by talking about the JFK assassination. And no one's gonna be able to hear about that at UW Stevens Point anymore. I mean, it is really amazing. So those are two restorations that can happen with some quickness. The DNR right away, the UW system gradually, but certainly with his leadership. And I'm glad he's being tactical about it, because he himself is a member of the Board of Regents, because the head of education is automatically on the Board of Regents. And rather than resigning his position and letting Walker replace him on the Board of Regents, he's waiting until he gets inaugurated as governor so that then he can replace himself on the Board of Regents. And so it doesn't bother me that he's playing a little bit of hardball. I mean, it's time that Democrats aren't afraid to use the power, the legitimate power that they have, and that's legitimate. So another thing I want the Evers administration to do, and this is in the bullseye of our work at Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, redo the campaign finance law. The campaign finance law was rewritten in November of 2015, 3 years ago, in a really disastrous way. I was up in the state Senate gallery. I was the only person up there other than a 22-year-old Senate page and a Capitol police officer. There was literally no one there. I was there from 7 till about 10:30 or 11. 7 at night. And what they did in this campaign finance drastic rewrite was, first of all, they got rid of the high-minded rhetoric in the preamble that said too much money in our elections is bad for democracy and leads to corruption. And we need transparency in our elections for our democracy to work properly. They just threw that out the window. And I was there when some Democratic state senators were saying, you know, offered an amendment, at least keep that nice rhetoric. At least say that you believe in these things, that we're supposed to believe in a democracy. Voted down. Party line vote. Boom. Out it went, out the window. And then what they did was they made it much easier for super wealthy people and corporations to throw their weight around in our elections, as though they don't have enough ability to throw their weight around before it was done. So what did they do? They doubled the amount that individuals can give to candidates. So it used to be, if you're super rich, you could give $10,000 to your favorite candidate for governor, Jim Doyle or Walker at the time, Scott McCallum, if you had a weird attraction to him. And I like Scott. I used to play basketball with Scott McCallum. So now it's $20,000. Who can write a check for $20,000 in this state? Not many people. And you know, rich and poor alike in Wisconsin can write checks for $20,000 to their favorite candidate for governor. And it's totally out of whack, because your favorite candidate for president, the most, if you're a rich person, you can give to that person running for president is $2,700. I mean, is governor of Wisconsin really 7.5 times more important than president of the United States? I mean, it's a totally ridiculous, huge amount to allow people to give directly. So that was one thing. They allowed corporations for the first time in more than 100 years to give directly to political parties. Poor fighting Bob LaFollette is dizzy spinning in his grave over that one. And this was also crazy. They tore down the ceiling on what individuals could give to political parties. It used to be there was an aggregate limit in Wisconsin, $10,000. You could give $10,000 to Jim Doyle, and then you could not give a dime to Russ Feingold for state assembly. You could not give a dime to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin or to anybody else who's doing electioneering. $10,000. And so if you knew rich people, they would say, I'm maxed out. I've maxed. No one can max out anymore. And partly it's because of a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2014 called the McCutcheon decision. McCutcheon decision said that this poor Republican guy who had spent $350,000 on Republican candidates all across the country was having his First Amendment rights infringed upon because he couldn't spend another $350,000 on other Republican candidates that he wanted to support. And so aggregate limits are now unconstitutional. And so the law in the books in Wisconsin that said there was a $10,000 aggregate limit did have to be amended. But what they could have done, there was a de facto $10,000 limit. If you gave $10,000 to the Democratic Party, you were done. They could have said, well, you now have a $10,000 limit that you can give to political parties, or if they wanted to get out their Dublin cube, you've got that $20,000 limit you can give to political parties. Instead, they said there is no limit whatsoever. And so now super rich people like Diane Hendricks and Beloit gave $1.5 million to the Republican Party of Wisconsin. And the Republican Party of Wisconsin can then turn around and give that $1.5 million to Walker for governor. So what is the purpose of having a $20,000 limit or any limit on what an individual can give to a candidate if you're going to allow that individual to turn around and give it to a political party that can act as a laundromat to give that back to the campaign of the person you just gave $20,000 to? It makes a mockery of the limit on individual donations. And, you know, there are Democrats, rich people who give a lot of money too. A philanthropist in Milwaukee gave $1 million to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin a couple of years ago. And so you might say, well, it evens out. You know, that's all right. There are rich people here and rich people there. But that's not how our democracy is supposed to work. We're not, as citizens, supposed to be reduced to the role of spectators watching a couple billionaires on the left and a couple billionaires on the right play tug-of-war. In a democracy, we're all supposed to have an equal tug on that rope, and we don't. And it's obvious to, I think, all of us that we don't have an equal tug on the rope, and we should have an equal tug on the rope. So that's another thing. And they also codified a horrible decision by the Wisconsin Supreme Court in July of 2015 that threw out the John Doe ruling. The John Doe investigation, fired the special prosecutor, gave Scott Walker a get-out-of-jail-free card because Scott Walker was violating the law at the time. There was credible evidence that he was violating the law. That's why he's being prosecuted. And what law was he violating? He was violating a law that said at the time that if you are a candidate for office in Wisconsin, you cannot coordinate with an outside electioneering group. And what was Walker doing? He was coordinating with Wisconsin Club for Growth. He was going around the country sitting on the laps of billionaires like Sheldon Adelson in Las Vegas and Harold Simmons, the lead manufacturer in Texas, asking them to write 7-figure checks, not to Walker for governor, but to Wisconsin Club for Growth. And then Walker's campaign ads would work with Wisconsin Club for Growth, literally telling them what radio script to run on the air in Wisconsin. So there was plenty of evidence. And so what did the Wisconsin Supreme Court do to get Scott Walker out of this mess that he was in, how to spring him out of this trap? Well, they waved their magic gavel and said the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution forbids the state of Wisconsin from banning coordination between candidates and outside issue advocacy groups like Wisconsin Club for Growth. And so away Scott ran. The problem is that by saying that, they also made a mockery of the limit on individual donations, and then the legislature in November codified that. And this is why. Say I'm running for governor, and I have a billionaire friend. I'm going to tell my billionaire friend, you know, don't be a chump, I don't even need your $20,000, I got a better idea. Write me a check for $2 million, but don't write it to my campaign, because there's a $20,000 limit on that. Got a better idea, write it to this third-party group with a benign, kind of nice-sounding name like Badgers for Eternal Victory. Write a $2 million check to Bev, and I will have my campaign manager go work for Bev and tell them how to use your $2 million. And the kicker is that Bev doesn't have to disclose that you gave them a single dime. And also, you can get a tax deduction for it, because it's a tax-deductible organization. And so that's current law here in Wisconsin. In fact, it's even worse, because the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court says you can't do that if it's an independent expenditure group, if they're telling you exactly who to vote for and who not to vote for. You're not an issue advocacy group anymore, you're an independent expenditure group. But the smart Alex in the legislature wrote a definition of coordination that makes it almost impossible to indict or convict anyone for illegally coordinating even with an independent expenditure group, because they said for you to be guilty of violating this law against coordinating with an independent expenditure group, two things have to happen. You have to explicitly ask that independent expenditure group to do X. And that independent expenditure group has to explicitly assent to say, I will do X. And, you know, politicians and campaign managers are clever enough to say, hey, I've got a great idea. Why don't you consider, you know, running this ad somewhere all across the state in the next week? And all the person has to say, sure, I'll consider it. So there wasn't a specific, explicit ask, and there wasn't an explicit acceptance of the ask, and they just are elbowing each other and nodding and winking, and boom, the deal is done, and it's done legally. That's how they wrote the law. So all of that has to be rewritten. And I've been working with Senator Chris Larson's office in Milwaukee on a model piece of legislation that will undo all of that damage. Some of it will have to go back to the state Supreme Court on the coordination thing, but undo all the other damage. Limit the amount that individuals can give, ban corporation donations to political parties and legislative campaign committees, and put a ceiling on donations to political parties. And also to require, which the new law doesn't, require donors to disclose who their employer is. Now they changed it, so all you got to say is what occupation you have. So a lot of people are writing $1,000 checks to whoever and just saying business person. There are thousands and thousands of business people, and it's almost impossible for the media that are overworked in this state and in this country to do the legwork to find out, you know, they're too busy. They can't find out which business person this is. We do that at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. If we weren't around, it would be almost impossible for people in Wisconsin to figure it out. I mean, look at Ashley Furniture, not run by a family called Ashley anymore. And so if you wanted to know how much money Ashley Furniture is giving to Walker, you used to be able to go to the government website and find out, because they had to require the employer. Now you can't. You can't find that out. You could go to our website, wisdc.org, and find it out, because we have a guy who is compulsive and researches all that stuff. But if we weren't around, it would be almost impossible. And so you wouldn't be able to find out easily as a citizen or as even a reporter what Ashley Furniture was getting in return for the donations that the Ashley employees were giving. And I was testifying against this at the Capitol. And these Republican legislators are saying, you know, it's outrageous that one of the employees of any company would give money, and then that company's reputation would be sullied because of a contribution that came from that company. It's not like the janitor is giving big donations, right? We look at this, and most of the big donations, like 95%, are from the CEO and other top executives. So the idea that their reputation is being sullied by the people who are way down the ranks is ludicrous, but that's what they were advocating. It's amazing to see the bad arguments that they will put forward. Fitzgerald is a genius at putting up bad arguments. And he will just say, he'll pull anything out of his ears to say, to justify a piece of legislation that serves his interests, no matter how ludicrous it was. For instance, I was testifying on the special elections bill. They were trying to pass a bill that said, actually, Scott Walker doesn't have to obey the law and call these special elections when there are vacancies, like there was up in Door County. And he was violating the law at the time. It took 3 judges to tell him to stop violating the law. Fitzgerald was going to solve the problem by just changing the law and make it retroactive. And I was there for when he was saying it. He said, well, it's impossible, these guys. You know, we've got an election in August, and then you're going to make them run for the same office in November. That's ridiculous. It's a waste of taxpayer money. You know, those were his arguments. I mean, he would come up with anything. But then they must have found a poll, because within hours of that hearing, they changed their mind. So anyway, it is edifying and alarming at the same time to go to these hearings and to see how disrespectful and outrageous the elected officials on the Republican side, anyway, have been. They've acted like playground bullies themselves, not paying attention to any of the testimony that they don't agree with, you know, kind of giggling or sneering when people are up there, whether it's citizens or representatives of organizations like mine. And it's just, and even of the Democratic elected officials on the other side, they would be disrespectful of. It's been really reprehensible behavior. So anyway, we need to correct this campaign finance problem. Another big thing that we work on at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, fair maps. Ban gerrymandering in Wisconsin. It is outrageous. Really outrageous that gerrymandering is allowed in Wisconsin, whichever party is in power on those decade, even years. But let's remember how rigged these maps were and how the rigging happened. In 2011, Walker, one of the Fitzgeralds, and the whole leadership got together and said, you know, we're going to redraw these maps. They're required to under the U.S. Constitution and the Wisconsin Constitution. It's the public's business. It's one of the most public things that they need to do as an obligation under our democratic system. So did they do the public's business in the public building, in the Capitol? No, they scurried across the street into the Glass Bank in the law offices of Michael Best and Friedrich, conservative law office, basically Walker's law firm, and they went into a room that was a locked room and became known as the map room. And the media wasn't allowed into the locked map room. The public, you and I, weren't allowed into the locked map room. Democrats sure weren't allowed into the locked map room. Even Republicans who weren't in leadership, they weren't allowed into the locked map room unless they got the keys from the two staffers of the speaker, young men in their 20s, who would allow them in the locked map room only to look at their redistricted district. They couldn't look at the whole statewide map, just their own district. And then before they could leave the locked map room, they had to sign an oath of secrecy that they could tell nobody else in Wisconsin what was going on with this redistricting map. That is not the way democracy is supposed to work. And so the process was horrible. And then they rigged the maps by hiring a political scientist who was great at drawing maps on computer, moving a line here, moving a line there, and predicting by moving that line that Republicans would be able to gain seats, even though the aggregate vote the aggregate vote was the same. And so they didn't draw one map. This guy, they paid him to draw 9 maps, each successive map being more aggressive than the other one. So it was aggressive map 1, aggressive map 2, aggressive map 3, all the way to 9. They took either aggressive map 8 or 9 and rammed it through the legislature in 10 days. And so that was the undemocratic process. And then what they did was, the guy knew what he was doing. And look what happened just last Tuesday. The Democrats got 54% of the aggregate vote of in the state assembly races. And Republicans have 63% of the seats in the assembly. I mean, that's good work if you can get it. So we need to redo that. We need a new model. The Iowa model's been working great over in Iowa, where they don't let the political party in power draw the maps. We shouldn't let that happen. We should let career civil servants draw the maps, like the Legislative Reference Bureau, for instance, do it with real specific criteria that prohibits a political party from gaming the system. It shouldn't be that hard to do. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's working great in Iowa. We can do that here. And this is an issue that's caught fire. I table sometimes at Farmers Market in Madison on Saturdays, about once a month. And you know, I'm not a passive guy, you'll be shocked to hear. So I stand up on the concrete there, and I'm waving this petition and saying, sign the petition here, ban gerrymandering in Wisconsin. We got 200 signatures in 2 hours. And I'm sure some of you here have done signature petition signing and gathering. It's not that easy, but the issue itself has just caught fire. Used to be people said, redistricting, gerrymandering, too obscure, people aren't gonna get it. People get it. 41 county boards in Wisconsin have passed resolutions telling the state legislature that they in their county, the people of their county want to ban gerrymandering in Wisconsin. 4 counties had referendums last Tuesday, and they passed overwhelmingly in all 4 counties. Sauk County, Eau Claire County, Lincoln County, Winnebago County. Overwhelming margins of referendums passed. The people want decency and fairness and a level playing field in Wisconsin, whether they identify as Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives, libertarians, whatever. They know the system's rigged and they want the system to be unrigged. So, fair maps, automatic voter registration. We got to make voting easier, not harder. These guys disgracefully made voting harder with their voter ID law, which I think should be wiped off the books. We got to make voting easier. One way to make voting easier is automatic voter registration. They have this in a lot of states. Oregon was the first. There's no reason why when you go interface with a government institution and tell them who you are that you can't be on the rolls right away. What's hard about that? Felon reenfranchisement. There was this great law, referendum that passed in Florida last Tuesday that is giving basic citizenship rights back to more than 1 million people. Felon reenfranchisement, and it won by more than 60% in Florida. And in Wisconsin, you cannot vote even when you get outside of jail or prison if you are still on paper, if you are still on probation or parole or under supervision. And that is ridiculous. It'd be one thing if you were convicted of voting fraud. Maybe then, you shouldn't be able to vote. But once you're out of jail and you've served your time, you should be able to vote anyway. And in 2 states in this country, you actually can vote in jail. In Vermont and in Maine, you can vote in jail. Prisoners have the right to vote. But as a half step, I think whenever anyone does their service behind bars and steps outside of those bars as a free person, that they should get their rights back to vote in our democracy. In a lot of industrial advanced societies that are democracies, people have the right to vote either in prison or certainly when they get outside the gates. So that's another thing to do. Local control. We've got to reestablish local democracy. These guys wrote more than 160 laws taking away the power of local governments to run their own business. You know, where you can have a cell tower. You can't decide that at the county level anymore because these guys took that power away from you. They took all sorts of power away from counties. Counties can't share equipment or labor with the next county over, and that's ridiculous. And there's just a whole bunch of things that they did that went against local control. You can't pass laws in a county to require landlords to be inspected in the first 8 years that they own a building. These guys in the legislature in Walker passed a bill in the last session that gave new landlords an 8-year holiday from any inspection. I mean, that is bizarre. It's so bad for tenant rights, but there you have it. And you can, you know, who were they serving? They were not serving their constituents. They were serving their donors. That's all they were doing, servicing their donors. They viewed their donors as their constituents, not the citizens as their constituents. And that's not how things should work. So those are kind of short-term things that we could hope for and we're going to push for as a pro-democracy agenda with Tony Evers. There are some more visionary things that I think we should push for as well. Full public financing of elections would really equalize the field. I mean, I want a democracy where everyone has an equal say. That shouldn't be such a difficult thing to arrive at or to agree to. I mean, that's what democracy should be. And we should have full public financing to make that happen. Badger Care for All, universal health care here in Wisconsin. That's another, I mean, some people are again back to kind of the status quo. People who've been working on farms, one of the spouses will go work for a company just to get the insurance for fear that these guys in Washington are going to take the Affordable Care Act away, and you can't take that risk. I get that. I'm a lymphoma survivor. If I got to work till 65. If I didn't even like my job, I'd be at my job. I love my job, but I can't go without health care for fear that they'll take away the guarantee to cover people with pre-existing conditions. And so Badger Care for All is something. Legalizing marijuana. We are late to the pot party here in Wisconsin. Here in Rock County, you voted 69% in favor of legalizing marijuana last Tuesday. And the people want it. This is people are way ahead of the politicians a lot of times. And on this issue, to get rid of prohibition, this is the modern day prohibition. It's time to get rid of it. It's ridiculous that we haven't gotten rid of it. It's ridiculous that we're not getting the tax revenues from what Colorado's been doing and other states are doing now. And anyway, there's so many people behind bars for petty marijuana offenses. It's ridiculous, and there are people who are suffering who could be who get alleviated from the pain and by being able to use medical marijuana at a bare minimum, and we can't even get that to happen here.
That's our last one.
Yeah, good. So you guys know all about that. Maybe you know about it firsthand. And then there is, let's get to a living wage. Let's get to $15 an hour in a hurry. This is what Bernie was talking about. Free public education, free college education, $15 an hour, universal health care. I mean, if we can't sell that, we can't sell popcorn in the movie theater. And these things should be easy to sell. And then a green economy. Let's get to that green economy here. Walker was opposed to solar and wind, and we can do that. And there's no reason he needs to be in the pocket of the Koch brothers who are the fossil fuel guys.
And one more, school vouchers.
Yeah, I mean, we need to look what happened in the school vouchers. Betsy DeVos's group, American Federation for Children. It's not a federation for children, it's a federation for the school voucher business. They gave Walker and Voss and Fitzgerald up to this current election about $5.6 million to keep Walker, Voss, and Fitzgerald in power. In return for that $5.6 million, they got $1.2 billion in tax revenues for our private voucher schools here that are siphoning money away from the public schools. So we need to restore our public schools. Absolutely correct. So those are some of the things I think we ought to do and campaign for. In the short term, there's likely, I mean, I'm not naive. I know there's going to be a log jam and there's going to be stalemates because the Republicans have control, largely because of the redistricting and the rigging of the maps. They've got control of the state Senate and the state assembly. But at least there is a check. There's a check on their power, and Evers will have some powers that he can, some executive authority that he can use unilaterally for the good. But yeah, I mean, the idea that Walker and Voss and Fitzgerald sold our state out, not the idea, the fact that they sold our state out to the Koch brothers and to Betsy DeVos and to Sheldon Adelson and to the lead manufacturer. They did pass laws that, you know, lessened the amount of lead inspections you could have and actually increased the amount of lead you could have in paint in Wisconsin.
Let's not forget Foxconn.
And then there is Foxconn. And the interesting thing about Foxconn is that Walker thought that was going to be a big feather in his cap. I mean, again, this is just corporate welfare to the nth degree, $4 billion worth. It's not economic development. What kind of economic development strategy is to give $4 billion to the first company from Taiwan that knocks on your door? How about thinking of all the other ways you might be able to use $4 billion? And prior to that, how about where did this $4 billion come from? Because we've been told for years and years and years, every budget, there's no money for our schools, there's no money for our roads, there's no money for clean energy, there's no money for the things that we need in this state. And all of a sudden there's $4 billion for a company with a terrible labor and environmental record that has a record of reneging on its agreements. And so Walker thought it'd be a great thing. Mark Pocan knew from the get-go that this was going to be a problem for Walker. And he was really kind of ahead of the curve. Mark Pocan predicting this was going to be a net minus for Walker. It might have helped him in Racine. Kenosha County, I think, went for Evers. And, you know, I travel all over the state. I travel in the northwest part of the state. They know that they're not going to benefit. And the Marquette poll showed that most people outside of Racine, Kenosha County, and Milwaukee County understood that they weren't going to benefit from this deal. And a lot of people outside of Madison and Milwaukee are sick and tired of seeing, you know, Madison and Milwaukee benefit from all these programs. That's Kathy Kramer's book, Politics of Resentment. That's where some of that resentment comes from. And I think the Foxconn thing only reinforced that. And so, yeah, we got to get away from corporate welfare. Evers wants to get rid of WEDC, Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, which Walker was running, used to be the Commerce Department, turned into, again, just a, you know, input, output, give favors to the donors. That's got to go too. And so there are a lot of things that can happen now. Some may happen quickly, some may happen more slowly, but, you know, the storm is over though. That's the good news, and that's why I think we need to celebrate. Enjoy this moment, enjoy the celebration. You know, there's the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney who said, once in a lifetime the great tidal wave of justice rises up and hope and history rhyme. Hope and history were rhyming last Tuesday. And I think they're going to rhyme. I think he's wrong. I think they will rhyme again in my lifetime and in yours. So, that's my sunny talk. But I'm happy to take questions.
Why do you think, Matt, the state Democratic Party and the National Democratic Party are so scared of progressive activists?
Well, the National Democratic Party is, and I know the Hillary Clinton campaign was very scared of it. I mean, I don't know why Hillary Clinton, I'm not going to be bashing Hillary Clinton all night, but I think she should have taken Bernie as vice president, or at least said, he's my labor secretary. She needed to acknowledge the legitimacy of the progressive base and the enthusiasm of the progressive base. And I think if she did that, she'd be president today. Partly it's a funding thing. They're in hock. Obama was in hock to Wall Street. They're in hock to Wall. A lot of the Democrats for funding purposes are in hock to donors who have different ideas than you and I about a lot of issues. So the state Democratic Party, I don't think, is that scared of the base. I know Martha Lanning, she's open anyway to listening about to progressives. I mean, that was a meeting where she was there with Mike McCabe and me and a couple other people telling her X, Y, and Z, and it wasn't like she was sneering at us. So at least she will listen, and I think the Evers campaign, by having Mandela Barnes, embracing Mandela Barnes, and the Mandela Barnes campaign itself was a nod to the progressive base in the state and helped Evers a lot, both in Milwaukee and on campuses around the state. Young people really turned out in droves this time, and in large part, I think that was Mandela Barnes. In fact, my idea for a poster road yard sign was Evers in small letters and Barnes.
I think the state party, there are two parties. There's Martha and the people hired or elected into that, and then there are our elected leaders. And they're not necessarily in agreement with each other, and they do owe their donors a lot. And people will, I have seen people fight on boards for any imaginary bit of power on a local board for something that doesn't pay anything at all because they want to keep a little bit of power. And so I think that's a huge dynamic in politics, right from the county to the top. But I think our elected Democrats in office are the Democratic Party for all practical purposes, not Mark.
Yeah. But some of those are real progressive. I mean, Mark Pocan is very progressive. He's in the Progressive Caucus. There are progressive people in the state legislature. Melissa Sargent is great. Katrina Shanklin, and she may be the first woman governor of Wisconsin. That's my prediction. She's in Stevens Point. She ran unopposed. She's a wonderful person. There are a lot of really good. Sandra Pope, Sandy Pope is great. And there are, Therese Berceau was great, and she just retired. Chris Taylor is excellent. There are a lot of good folks in there. So I do hear what you're saying about power, people wanting to grab power. And it's not just true with elected officials, it's true in the nonprofit sector. There's some old white guys who never want to let go. I'm going to let go when I'm 65, and I'm 60 now, so I'm not going to hang on there forever. I believe in passing the baton on to other people, and I think that's really important. And there are a lot of legislators who've been there a long, long, long time who need to step aside, and that's why I congratulate Therese Berceau for recognizing that she needs to make room, and she made room.
Help me understand how the fair maps are going to get drawn this time.
They're not going to get drawn this time. So this is first of all, let me just talk about the Supreme Court case, and then let me talk about what's likely to happen this time. The U.S. Supreme Court kicked the case back to the lower level in June, saying that the Democratic plaintiffs, not all of them, demonstrated sufficient standing. So that case is going to be argued in April in the Blue Federal Building in Madison downtown, and then it's going to get appealed by either side that lost back to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then they're going to rule. I don't have great hopes for the U.S. Supreme Court with Trump's appointees on there, that they are likely to vote in a good way. But we can solve that problem if we elect enough officials to change the law. Those officials aren't in power right now, though Tony Evers has pledged to be for fair maps, and I take him at his word on that. But certainly Voss and Fitzgerald and the Republican caucuses don't want fair maps. So what's going to happen? The Republicans are going to draw a rigged map. Evers is going to veto it, and then it's going to go to a judge who's going to hire a map drawer who's going to draw the maps. And that's what happened in 2000 and in 1990. So it's happened before, it'll happen this time. And I guarantee we'll have a better map than we had in 2011. But I do hope we get to a point where we can have realistic maps drawn in a nonpartisan, independent, transparent way. Right. It's not an impossibility. Yeah.
Maybe you talked about this and I missed it because I was late, but what kind of damage can Voss and his friends do to the governorship of Tony Evers before January 7th? Well,
I'm sure they're lying awake at night scheming about it. They're schemers and connivers, and they want to obstruct and subvert the will of the people. Yeah, I was playing tennis on last Sunday morning with a guy who used to be, who's an attorney, retired from the Legislative Reference Bureau, who was suggesting, maybe I shouldn't even say this and give them this idea, though I'm sure they thought of it, that maybe they could even finagle it so that that Evers loses that magic veto power. They have to amend the Constitution to get that done, though, so I thought it was impossible to do, but this guy was saying, well, look, To amend the Constitution, you have to pass a bill in 2 successive legislatures. The governor doesn't have to sign it, and then it goes to a referendum. So he said, well, maybe they'll do that in special session before the end of the year, and they'll have control of the legislature in the spring, and then they could put it on the referendum in April, and boom, they could get rid of it by May. And that's the most dramatic thing they could do. What they're trying to do publicly, they're talking about changing the composition of WEDIC, of the WEDIC board, because they want to make sure it still is giving out money to their buddies, I think, and lessen the power of the governor and the governor's appointees on that board. And they want to protect their voter ID law. I don't know how they're going to do that. But they are thinking of a bunch of ways to limit his power. Maybe they'll change his ability to appoint to the Wisconsin Board of Regents. And so I just don't know. But I know they're trying a lot of things. They want to do something on Foxconn to tie his hands on Foxconn too. So it's amazing just how quickly they jumped all over that. And to say that they represent the will of the people with these rigged maps, having lost 54% of the vote in the state assembly, it's pretty astonishing.
Is the hope on that they just realize their ill ways and the people? I mean, can't they still put this through regardless? I mean, as long as Walker okays it and doesn't veto it before it's done?
Well, they're going to try to put through a lot. I mean,
what's going to stop them?
Well, what's going to stop them is, you know, there are sometimes they get stopped in their tracks because they can't stand the heat. Remember several July 4ths ago, right before the weekend, Voss tried to change the law on transparency so that the public couldn't find out how the legislation was being made. It would have shielded legislators and gagged legislative staff members for life from discussing how the legislation was made. And they took so much flack over the July 4th holiday, flack from every editorial writer practically in the state, and from tons of their constituents, who maybe they were throwing tomatoes at the July 4th parade at them, I don't know, but they came back to Madison and they said, we can't get this done. And in the Senate may be the place where things stop, because there are a couple decent Republican senators. Rob Coles from Green Bay, for instance, the only Republican senator to vote against the campaign finance horrible rewrite that I talked about. Very decent man, believes in fairness. And Luther Olson also is a possible problem for them. And so, you know, they may not get to where they need to be. And otherwise, besides that, these guys have fallen out like thieves. Walker hates Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald hates Voss. Voss hates Fitzgerald and Voss. And Voss hates Fitzgerald and Walker. I mean, they hate each other. And so, yeah, they may not be able to get it done. And so that's a hope I have.
Well, can I just follow up on that? You can ban me from this conference then if I talk too much.
No, go ahead.
Now that Walker's gone, will Voss and Fitzgerald not feel a need to protect and support him? Will something change because he's out of the picture and they don't need to do his bidding, they don't need to say it?
Well, I don't think they're doing his bidding. I think they're all working for the same folks. Walker, Fitzgerald, and Voss don't run Wisconsin. They're water boys for the people who run Wisconsin. They're water boys for the same people. And those are the Koch brothers and Betsy DeVos and Diane Hendricks and Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. And you throw in the realtors and big factory farmers and you got the whole thing. Those are the folks they work for. And so, you know, maybe their bosses will tell them that they have to get in line and obey the imperative to help out. Well, I mean, look at Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. They spent $20 million to keep Walker, Fitzgerald, and Voss in power. That was before this election. And I went to their website after the last session ended, just to see what they were going to say. And they said, our victories were too numerous to mention, but we are going to spend in the next election to make sure that the right legislators, that was their expression, get elected so that we can pursue our agenda further. And they were pretty blunt about what they're about. And so, yeah, that's who Walker represents, is Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce and the other big donors. So I would just encourage people to write letters to the editor in this little interregnum, letters to the editor saying Voss and Fitzgerald have got to be stopped in their effort to subvert the will of the people. Write those letters to the editor and call the legislators themselves. Call Walker, Call Fitzgerald, call Voss, call your own representatives, and raise holy hell, because that could stop them. And this message that they are subverting the will of the people and getting rid of the checks and balances is something that you should stress, I think.
Yeah.
You were going next.
Do you think Tony Evers will appoint Kathleen Bynum for some?
You know, I don't know. I was talking with Dale Schultz a couple of months ago. You know, Dale was former Senate Majority Leader for the Republicans from Richland County, a super nice guy, who was for Tony Evers, by the way. I was waiting for the commercial showing Dale Schultz for Tony Evers, but they never ran it. He told me that he was advising Evers to make a spot for all the other people on stage with him, including Mike McCabe. Find a spot for the other candidates. And I thought it was good advice, and I wouldn't be surprised if that advice was taken, at least most of it. So, and Kathleen Bynum, I think she was a great state senator. She really served her constituents well. She wrote a tremendous newsletter every other week that her constituents loved, talking about what was going on in the Capitol. She knew the budget better than anybody, certainly better than Walker and Fitzgerald and Voss. I went into her office once to talk to her. She pulls out this budget, and she has Post-it notes, color-coordinated Post-it notes throughout the budget, color-coordinated by issue. I mean, it was amazing piece of homework that she'd done on her budget and on that budget and her alternative budget. And you know, I kind of wish that she had dropped out earlier, and I wish the same thing for Dana Wachs, because it was clear way before June 1st, which was their deadline, way before June 1st, that they weren't going to make it. And in fact, Dana Wachs got out about June 5th or 6th. And maybe they didn't want to offend the people who had already set up their campaigns to run for their positions. But I hate losing Dana Wachs and Kathleen Bynum in the legislature. They're two great legislators. Really decent people. Very smart.
One's a real quick answer. So we don't expect to be able to change the maps till 2022, right?
No, it's actually, the first time we're going to have fair maps in Wisconsin, I hate to say it, it's 2030. Because they're redrawn every 10 years. And a judge is probably going to redraw it in 2020. And between 2020 and 2030, the legislation, I guarantee it will change so that we get fair maps in Wisconsin. But the next time to draw those maps won't be till 2030 unless a judge intervenes and say these maps were too rigged and they violate the constitutional rights. Because that's actually what the federal court said, the panel of 3 judges said a couple of years ago when they ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. They said this is a violation of the plaintiffs' constitutional rights. They should not have to suffer during another election under maps that are violating their constitutional rights, and ordered the maps to be redrawn before the election that just happened. But the U.S. Supreme Court waved that away. But yeah, we're a ways off before we're actually going to be able to enjoy fair maps in Wisconsin, but we can change the law so that people do enjoy it, 12 years from now.
The other part was related to Lisa Neubauer. For example, what do you anticipate for the Wisconsin Supreme Court coming up April 2018? I know Lisa's running, but I don't know other candidates.
Yeah, I haven't focused on that yet. I mean, my sense is that the organizing that was done this November to get Evers over the top will persist into the Supreme Court case. And actually, the last Supreme Court race may have been a dry run for Tony Evers. And so I think it's hopeful that another good justice will get on the court. I'm worried about Shirley Emersen's health. I hope she's fighting a cancer battle, evidently, and she's been just a terrific justice. So I wish her the best of health and a speedy recovery, and we need her on the court. But certainly she's served long enough. If she wants to retire, she should retire. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we got, and I talked myself blue in the face. So I thank you for